Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started in just a few moments. For those of you just joining us, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for our September webinar. We're going to go ahead and get started in just a few minutes. Just hang on tight. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you. Once again, we're going to get started in just a few moments. Hang tight. Thank you. Thank you again, everyone, for your patience. We're just going to get started in about another minute or so. We're just letting some people sign on here. Just give us one more minute. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you again for joining ACT on today's webinar. Today we will be hosting the session CMAQ from A to Z, latest on program eligibility and performance measurement. We want to thank our two speakers today, Jason Pavelchuk and Kelly McGordy, for speaking. And just a few reminders for you all before we get started. First, I want to let you know if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please go ahead and type them in the question box down below. Everyone is currently muted, so that is the best way if you do have a question to ask us, and we'll make sure that we get it to the speaker right away. There are some handouts below as well, especially I know Jason has included his PowerPoint on here. If there is something you want to download ahead of time or print out, please feel free to do so now. This session is also being recorded, and we will be having it up on our website within 24 hours after this event. So if you missed part of this or if you want to replay it again, we will have it recorded and available for you by tomorrow afternoon. Lastly, we will have evaluations going out at the end. We would love for you to fill that out and give us your feedback on today's webinar. It is much appreciated and always welcome for us to kind of reevaluate and what sessions worked and didn't and what we can do better for the future. So without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and introduce David Strauss, our Executive Director here at ACT, for a few things going on with the association right now. David, take it away.
Thank you, Casey, and thank you everyone for joining today's call. We had over 250 people registered for today's webinar, and which is a great turnout and a good sign of interest in this topic. Folks representing a wide range of sectors within transportation demand management. And just want to take a quick poll just to get a sense of how many people are watching the presentation at your location today. So we're going to open up a quick poll here and give folks about 30 seconds or so to mark which one of those best represents the numbers at your site. ACT's webinars are really a great opportunity to provide professional development, learning opportunities for you, your staff, your partners, your clients. We hope that all of you will take advantage of these webinars and bring folks together to watch these sessions. So why don't we go ahead and close that poll and see, whoops, oh, we don't get to see the results.
I just closed it. It was about 75%.
Sorry. Okay, so 75% watching on their own,
yeah.
25%
watching on their own.
More. All right. ACT is an international association and leading advocate for commuter transportation and transportation demand management professionals. We strive to really get the most out of our transportation system while improving the lives of commuters, increasing the livability of communities, and supporting economic growth of businesses as we really look to create a better journey for everyone. Just quick show, want to find out who out there is actually a member of ACT. So we'll open up a poll very quickly. Take a moment. There's 3 choices, so it shouldn't take too long. You know, if you already are a member of ACT, you know the great benefits that we have and the services that you receive from the association, including networking, learning, advocacy, public policy, and research that we do. If you're not a member of ACT, I invite you to join us and encourage you to attend an upcoming conference. We have our TDM Forum in Las Vegas, October 17th and 18th next month. As well, in the coming year, ACT will be rolling out the launch of our TDM Professional Certification Program. This is a great new initiative that we have, and we thank many of you for taking the time to complete our recent jobs analysis survey that went out over the summer, which was an important first step in that process. So it looks like 62% of the folks on the call are ACT members, 30% are not ACT members. So again, I invite you all to learn more about the association, and if you have any questions, to reach out to myself or others to learn about membership. So today's webinar is focused on an important topic for all of us, and that is CMAQ. Congestion Mitigation Air Quality Program is one of the many federal programs that can fund TDM activities. The purpose of this webinar is to provide a broad overview of the program and eligibility, and our presenters will go over kind of the program basics, who controls CMAQ funds, how you can access those funds, eligibility requirements, the FAST Act performance measures and recent changes to the program, and an update on interim guidance and policies ACT is seeking. So without further ado, I want to introduce Jason Pavlichuk, ACT's Government Affairs Director, who has been leading ACT's work and advocacy and policy on this issue for many years, to start up today's webinar.
Thanks, David, and good afternoon, everyone. We've got a lot of ground to cover here in a relatively short amount of time, so I'm going to do my very best to go through this and in many ways sort of give an A to Z background. Many of you are very familiar with the CMAQ program and want the latest information. Some of you, this will be the first time you've heard of the program. So I'm going to do my very best to provide sort of a top to bottom sort of summary that is beneficial to all parties. Just a quick agenda overview. From my perspective, we'll start with an overview of the CMAQ program. We'll get into some of the changes made by the FAST Act, cover some of the key areas that were included in the 2013 guidance for CMAQ. I should note that that guidance is still interim guidance, and we are awaiting final guidance, waiting patiently, I might add. And we'll go a little bit into some of the performance measures and how that will specifically affect the CMAQ program and how some of the system performance measures in Section 150 as well as some of the CMAQ performance measures will alter how states and metropolitan planning organizations decide how to use CMAQ performances. And then with us, I'll turn it over to Kelly McGordy, who I will introduce later, but she will talk a little bit about the process that her organization, the Puget Sound Regional Council, handles CMAQ funds, and then sort of give a real-life example of some of the policy that I'll be discussing. Let me start a little bit with the CMAQ, an overview of the CMAQ, and some of the changes that were made. First of all, CMAQ is one of the core federal highway programs. It is a formula program. The way the CMAQ program, the Congestion Mitigation Air Quality CMAQ, the way it works is it is a formula program that is provided to all 50 states regardless of air quality impacts. However, if a city or a county is actually in non-attainment for either ozone or PM 2.5, particulate matter, then it receives an increased amount of CMAQ formula funds based upon the percentage of population that lives in a non-attainment area. And the Environmental Protection Agency determines when counties are in non-attainment, and once you are in non-attainment, then that population counts towards the weighted factor. I believe all but 16 states include a county that is in non-attainment for either PM 2.5 or ozone, and those states, the CMAQ funding must be spent in a non-attainment or maintenance issue. For states that do not have a CMAQ or a county in non-attainment, they are allowed to spend CMAQ dollars as if they were Surface Transportation Block Grant dollars. But for the most part, a vast majority of ACT's memberships and a vast majority of those organizations that are involved in transportation demand management fall either in a non-attainment area or in a state that has a non-attainment area. And judging by the numbers of you on the phone, most of you, I imagine, are in a non-attainment area. So a couple of general conditions for CMAQ. And this comes directly from the 2013 guidance and actually comes from a number of the web files and webinars that the Federal Highways has done. There are three sort of basic conditions for a project to qualify. It must be a transportation project, it must generate emissions reduction, and it must be located in a non-attainment or maintenance area, again, provided that it's in one of those 34 states that have a non-attainment or maintenance area. So those are the three sort of core tenets of what makes a transportation project eligible under CMAQ. There are a variety of categories. I'm not going to go into all of those categories, but those categories are listed within the CMAQ guidance, which you can find in the handouts. And my purpose today isn't necessarily to go through step by step every type of project that is eligible. What I plan on covering today are some of the more specific issues that have come up in regard to projects that are eligible in terms of how long they're eligible, what types of projects are eligible, and what type of activities. So that sort of provides a basic premise in terms of what the CMAQ program is. A couple of things I will note that are not allowed within the CMAQ program. First and foremost, expanding roadways is currently not allowed under the CMAQ program. You cannot use CMAQ funds to simply expand a highway. If you are to expand highway capacity, it can only be to build or planning to build an HOV or hot lane. You cannot use CMAQ dollars to fund highway capacity, which is obviously something that is very good for our association. Looking at some of the changes that were made by the FAST Act, I should note that there were very few programmatic changes made to CMAQ. There were two items of eligibility that were clarified. Specifically, it clarifies the eligibility of port-related freight operations, so long as emission reductions are attained. That includes greening of cranes and other facilities along a port that would allow for freight movement to be cleaner. And it also allows for the installation of vehicle-to-infrastructure communication as an eligible project under the CMAQ program. What you see here in the second bullet is a look at the overall increase of the federal program itself, starting on FY15 at a $2.27 billion program, and at the end of the FAST Act, CMAQ will be a $2.5 billion program. That is an annual authorization. I will note that that money is guaranteed so long as the Highway Trust Fund and the FAST Act is honored. That shouldn't be a problem, at least through FY20. So we see a relatively significant increase year over year. One other thing I will note is that carpool vanpool projects are still eligible for 100% federal share. Other CMAQ projects must have an 80-20 share, meaning that any 80% of the project cost can be covered by the federal government, and 20% must be covered by either a local or entity sponsoring the project or some other source of funding. What I want to spend a little bit of time today talking about is guidance. What is guidance? Guidance is a document that really sets the rules and regulations for any underlying piece of legislation. When you look at federal law is intended to be as short as possible. There isn't a lot of description or descriptive language included in federal law or U.S. code. Guidance provides that descriptive nature, that description on how both Federal Highway intends on executing the program, as well as what states should expect out of the program. So the guidance is generally updated following a major authorization. In this case, CMAQ went through a number of changes as a part of MAP 21, which was the predecessor to the FAST Act. And this legislation, this guidance really is setting the tone. Right now, as I mentioned, it's interim guidance, and I'll get into some of the comments that ACT made later, some of the things we're trying to fix. But even though it's interim guidance, it is still the guidance of the day, and we are hoping that some of the changes we requested will be made, but we'll get into that later. So the first thing that sort of came up and comes up in CMAQ projects and something that needs to be understood is first and foremost, is the project that you are looking to fund a capital investment, or is it an operating, some type of operating assistance? CMAQ makes very clear distinction between capital projects and operating projects. Capital projects, which are usually one-time expenses, are fully eligible to be funded under FTA under CMAQ, so long as it meets the requirements that we described a moment ago, reducing emissions, as well as it being a transportation project. However, many projects also include some type of operating assistance, whether it's operating a TMA, whether it is operating or providing some type of subsidy for a transit system. Operating system under federal guidance is limited to 5 years. And the way the assistance works at the federal level is that the 5 years are limited as such. Year one, for example, for a project may be $1 million. Year two can also be $1 million. But years 3, 4, and 5 can only amount to that $1 million. So, and they've got to be in a downward slope. So, for example, if I am subsidizing a transit system or a transit line of some type, I can spend $1 million in year one and year two. But in year 3, I can only spend $500,000. Year 4, I can only spend $300,000, and then year 5, no more than $200,000. Where again, those last 3 years equal to the highest level, and then are in somewhat of a downward slope. That is actually an extension of prior practice, which only limited operating assistance to 3 years. And here is some of the sort of the examples that Federal Highways gives. A couple of things that I want to mention. This is incredibly important for TDM purposes. Marketing and outreach are in no way, shape, or form subject to operating limits. So when agencies or when TDM entities write a grant, it is incredibly important to separate marketing and outreach activities from the rest of your grants. One of the prime issues that we've had with the CMAQ program is that TMAs have bumped up against this 5-year limit, where state DOTs have told them, hey, we can't fund you anymore because you've been using CMAQ funds for 5 years. And the reason that's a problem is because those marketing and outreach dollars have been mixed in with general operations. So it is true, a TMA cannot be subsidized for more than 5 years for direct operations, salary, benefits, things of that nature. However, there are many activities that TMAs provide that are not operating expenses, specifically marketing and outreach. So it is very important when you put together your grant application to make a clear distinction between anything that would be considered marketing and outreach versus day-to-day operations. At the same time, similar discussions need to be taking place when it comes to van pool projects. First and foremost, acquisition of a van pool, a contract or a partnership with a private van pool provider, or purchasing capital is a capital expense, and as such not subject to any type of 5-year limit. Marketing and outreach in support for van pooling also is not subject to a 5-year limit. However, I've seen a lot of grants that were written in such a way that state DOTs and then eventually federal highways cannot distinguish between general day-to-day operations versus those projects which are marketing and providing outreach for van pool projects. So again, very important that this distinction is made between capital, operating, and then marketing and outreach. And what you have here is sort of a very brief description of the federal guidance, which looks at the difference in cost in terms of what is a capital cost versus what is considered operating, and as such limited to the five-year limitation. And again, a lot of it comes down to, in many ways, identifying specific expenses and what they're used for. Moving here along, again, I sort of covered this a little bit, but marketing is not included, and this also includes guaranteed ride home programs. Federal Highways has determined that guaranteed ride home programs are considered a marketing tool. So any type of guaranteed ride home program may be funded indefinitely. However, quite often we have seen unequal application of guidance for a lot of these projects. So if you're running into this issue, it's important to let us know at ACT National, because we can work with our partners at Federal Highways to help resolve a lot of the programs. I've seen a lot of good projects end because either grants weren't written the right way, or that Federal Highway regional offices did not utilize the guidance properly. So if this is an issue, please let us know. Moving forward here, as I mentioned, the TMAs themselves can be funded with CMAQ dollars, and their startup costs and operating costs can be funded for up to 5 years. But again, many of the activities of a TMA are not subject to operating limitations, and as such can be funded indefinitely. There's a couple of things that ACT is working on in terms of clarification. I think one of the largest challenges that we have seen as an industry and as an association is the unequal and, quite frankly, rather arbitrary application of federal highway guidance of the CMAQ program. And this comes down to the fact that, at least in terms of the federal highway program, all 50 states have a federal highway liaison, and they are essentially the voice and the key point of contact for state DOTs in determining what is right and what is wrong and what is eligible and ineligible. And with that, there's a lot of variance in terms of what some agencies allowed versus what other agencies aren't allowed to do. There have been nearly identical projects that have been going on for 15 years in some states, and other states are deemed not eligible at all. So a lot of what ACT is working to do at the federal highway, within the federal guidance, is to answer some of these critical questions and really tie the screws to federal highways, that there needs to truly be one set of rules that applies to everybody. And we are working with federal highways to make sure that there's one, consistency in the rulings, and two, that some of these questions that have come up are very clear. One of those questions comes down to operations and labor. As I mentioned, marketing and outreach is specifically referenced multiple times in the guidance as not subject to a 5-year limit. However, some state federal highway offices have said that operations and labor tied to marketing and outreach are subject. That was clearly not the intent of federal highways, nor is it the intent of Congress that education, that labor associated with education outreach is subject to limitations. We've had at least 10 states that I know of that have made such rulings, and federal highways to this point has been reluctant to overrule them. So again, we are requesting that this question of, does the labor associated with education and outreach qualify for beyond the 5-year limit, or are they simply saying that the actual materials printed out are the only things that were to qualify it, and that to me is sort of ridiculous that would be the conclusion they come to. But again, because there isn't a clear distinction in guidance, some state federal highway offices have made a rather strict interpretation of what is and isn't eligible, and they've ruled that labor tied to it is not. So again, we're sort of looking at answering that question. Some other questions that have come up have come down to use of incentives. There are a lot of projects where incentives are used to change behavior, whether it's a prize or cash incentives or gift cards, what have you. Generally speaking, federal highways has sort of objected to the use of physical gifts or prizes as a way of utilizing federal highway dollars. However, that doesn't mean that they've not been used. And even this week, I asked the question to federal highways to specifically identify guidance in what's known as the super circular, whereby, and the super circular is essentially a very broad document that is supposed to govern all federal highway grants. I asked them to provide citation as to where it says that commuter incentives or any type of incentives were not allowed to be utilized, and they have yet to respond with a citation. And I've spent probably 4 or 5 hours looking through different circulars looking for specific language. However, what we do know is that federal highways frowns upon the use of CMAQ dollars for incentives. But that is something we are trying to clarify, because then, again, there are a number of programs where some type of cash or prize incentive has been utilized in order to affect behavior and change. And I think there's a significant amount of evidence to show that using some type of commuter incentive does in fact change behavior, and as such it reduces emissions and should be in fact eligible. So that is something that we are asking for clarity and consistency on, because again, without a known set of standard rules, it's very tough for agencies to look at best practices over and over again. Something else that has sort of been a problem of note, CMAQ guidance related to van pools. The guidance itself discusses arrangements between public and private sector, and the guidance talks about leases. And anyone who's been involved in a contract or service provision between the public and private sector related to van pool realizes that it's a contract for service and not a lease. And those are two very, very different legal documents and two very, very different legal arrangements, and that we are trying to, which has a variety of implications that I could spend at least an hour on, but I won't for right now. But simply to say that amending CMAQ guidance to clarify, again, the existing realities of the van pool world, in the sense that right now those agreements are contracts for service and not leases. Those are some of the key issues, and I will simply just sort of pull up very quickly here. This is a copy of the letter that we have sent to DOT that sort of clearly identifies what we're looking at in terms of some of the questions and some of the specific relationships to the guidance itself. You can find all of these on the handouts page, as well as a copy of the 2013 Interim Guidance. I want to spend the last few minutes here talking a little bit about the impacts of performance measures. And I'm not going to get into an entire discussion on performance measures themselves, simply because that in its own right could take an hour. But as many of you are aware, performance measures were included in FAST Act and NAP 21 as a way of guiding state DOTs to make investments for the most cost-effective and efficient projects. And as a part of that, there are two areas and two metrics that state DOTs must look at that sort of have an impact on CMAQ. And the first is performance of the interstate and the national highway system. And separately, there are controls over CMAQ. I will simply start by saying initially both of those metrics were based upon the need to move vehicles. ACT, along with other associations, pushed incredibly hard to not focus on the number of vehicles moved and instead focus on the number of people moved. And what I can only describe as something of a somewhat stunning turnabout, US DOT agreed with us and revamped many of the metrics that we're looking at to focus on a per person basis, which to me is going to, over time, really change the way that states and MPOs look at TDM projects, in the sense that TDM will become a much greater, a much higher rated solution than other projects, and something that we hope more states will invest more money in TDM. And again, this is looking at some of the final rule and some of the changes that were made. It focuses on reliability, on a percentage of impacted travelers. It changes the delay measure to per person hours of delay. It adds a modal share measure. There was a greenhouse measure, however, that is currently on hold. The Trump administration has placed that on hold. So these are things, and additional information and on some of the specifics of the rules can be found in this PowerPoint slide. Again, I don't want to go through all of them, but as you can see here, many of these metrics will have an impact on what projects are selected for the CMAQ program, and these three measures here in particular are sort of the key elements that state DOTs and MPOs will have to look at. The percent of non-SOV travel, they will have to increase that modal share year after year, and then as well as the annual hours of peak excessive delay per capita. And nothing improves those two measures better than TDM. So these are things that we're working on. I'm now going to turn it over to Kelly McGordy. Kelly is a senior program manager at the Puget Sound Regional Council, which is the MPO for the Seattle Central Puget Sound region. Kelly manages the Transportation Planning Department at PRSC, which encompasses the development of the region's long-range metropolitan transportation plan, known as Transportation 2040, and the distribution of PSRC's Federal Transportation Fund. Kelly also manages the agency's Air Quality and Climate Change Work Program and works closely with the region's federal, state, and local air quality partner agencies. Prior to joining PSRC in 1999, Kelly is with the MPO in Spokane, Washington, where she performed transportation and air quality modeling and analysis. Her background also includes experience with environmental consulting and urban renewal agencies, performing environmental assessments and inspections on commercial and residential properties. She has an undergraduate degree in environmental policy and assessment from Western Washington University and a graduate degree in environmental science from University of Texas at San Antonio. She has been a member of the Puget Sound Clean Air Agency's Advisory Council since 2012 and the Leadership Council for the American Lung Association since 2013. With that, I will turn it over to Kelly. Kelly, take it away.
All right, thanks, Jason, and thanks, everyone. I will try to go through some of these slides pretty quickly because some of them are just background on who we are, and really what I'm going to do is talk about how we do project selection here at PSRC, particularly for CMAQ. So for those of you who don't know us, we're the MPO for the 4-county Central Puget Sound region. We do a variety of things: transportation, growth management, and economic development planning, as well as modeling and data analysis. And you can see from this slide kind of the variety of 4 counties, 82 cities, a lot of different membership. When we do project selection, we queue up what we call our policy framework. We have 4 boards here at PSRC: Transportation Policy Board, Growth Management Policy Board, Economic Development Board, and then at the top tier, our Executive Board. And we call on volunteers from all 4 of these boards to serve on a project selection task force. Our elected officials and board members are very keenly interested in our project selection process. And we call on them to review the policies and procedures for how we're going to conduct project selection. We do this prior to every time we do project selection, which is about every 2 years. And that effort culminates in what we call our policy framework for federal funds. This really details how we're going to conduct the process. All of our processes are based on our regional policies, which is comprised in Vision 2040. And there's really a focus on using our federal funds to support both our regional and local centers for compact development and growth and the corridors that serve them. So for our funding, we have roughly $260 million a year in federal transportation funds. The majority of that comes to us through the Federal Transit Administration. I'm not going to talk about that today, but we have about $80 million under FHWA, and of that, for our CMAQ dollars, it's about $26 million a year. When we do project selection, we conduct one process with concurrent competitions, and you can see from the colored table how we break up our federal transportation fund in the various competitions. And today I'm going to focus on the competitions for the highway funds with a specific emphasis on CMAQ. But every single one of these competitions does follow the direction that our board provides in the policy framework. And I'll just keep going at that. So focusing in on our Federal Highway Administration competition, we really start with both STP and CMAQ funds are combined together. We have one total estimated amount for the competition. We're going to be doing project selection in 2018 for 2 years worth of funds, 21 and 22 funds. And we do this in perhaps somewhat of a unique way. So we split our funds into two. So we set aside a portion of the funds for a regional competition. These are for large-scale regional projects that support our regionally designated centers. And the balance of funds is distributed among each of our 4 countywide organizations for a countywide competition. So on our regional competition, we have a limited number of submittals that's allowed. PSRC staff basically owns that process in terms of scoring and evaluation. And we do place a greater amount of our CMAQ funds in the regional competition because we for 2 reasons. One, we want to make sure that we are getting the biggest bang for our buck in terms of estimated CMAQ reduction, so we focus that into our regional competition. There is still some CMAQ that goes down to the countywide competitions, but our countywide organizations would prefer having the more flexible STP, and the CMAQ projects that are funded through our countywide competitions tend to be smaller scale projects such as smaller scale ITS, bicycle pedestrian investments, and things of that nature. So this is just a high-level summary of what's included in our project evaluation criteria, and this really is the summary that applies to all of our competitions regardless of funding source, regardless of which pathway the funds are flowing. Again, our vision policies are to support centers. That could be regional centers, it could be local centers. We have provisions for projects improving safety, mobility, and accessibility. Equity is a big consideration in our region, so we do have some elements related to the populations being served by the project, including health and equity. An important thing to note is emissions reduction is included in all of our processes regardless of funding source. That is included in our criteria, but of course it's a much higher weighted value for our CMAQ dollars. And in 2016, we did start to incorporate cost effectiveness in the scoring of our CMAQ dollars. This was something that we hadn't done before, even though it is a focus of the federal legislation that calls for selecting the most cost-effective CMAQ projects. And I'll spend a little time talking about that. We also look at project readiness in our financial plans. We have a very robust project tracking system, and we monitor the use of our federal funds to make sure that, and we have fairly stringent criteria about that, and we have annual delivery targets for highway funds in our state. So this is something that we've been working on over the past decade. So this is will come as no surprise probably to the folks on the phone, but this is just an example of the information that we're sharing with sponsors in terms of how their projects might have the potential to reduce emissions. And then again, at the bottom of this slide, for CMAQ projects only in 2016, the air quality score is actually now based on cost effectiveness. This is the simple formula, and I'll walk through that in just a moment. So for the cost effectiveness, we did update this in 2016. We've always utilized, we have a project level emissions estimation tool. So we have our regional models and our regional air quality analyses, but then we also recognize that the project level is a different beast. And so we've been using a project level emissions estimation tool, and we spent quite a bit of time leading up to our 2016 process to update that tool based on the most recent MOVES model and emission factors, our most recent household survey, as well as the current thinking from national research, regional research, local research, so that we have the most robust default data we could. We do ask our sponsors to provide any project-specific data they have to help best estimate the emissions reduction potential, but we also recognize that many project sponsors don't have that data. So this tool has really been invaluable because then we can rely on those default data, whether it's national, regional, or local, to help us do the best job at estimating the emissions that we can. So the tool itself, really, as I mentioned, we've had this for many, many years, but the update really streamlined it, made it a bit more user-friendly. I mentioned we updated all of our default data. We've also provided a lot of guidance and documentation, so the sponsors really, they see exactly how we are estimating. They can see the data play in. The tool is available to them. We also provide guidance information. And I'll walk through that. We ask specific questions of our sponsors based on the type of project that they're submitting. And what we're trying to get is that baseline conditions and then the impacts from the project. So these are just some examples. If it's a roadway project being submitted, and again, the emissions are estimated for all projects regardless of funding source. But for roadway projects, of course, these are the things that we're looking for. We want to know what the traffic is before and after the project. Is the project being lengthened? What is the percent of truck traffic on the facility? Because that has an important emissions component to it. Improvements in speed, things of that nature. One thing that I think is of no surprise to anyone, while we ask sponsors to provide project-specific data to the extent possible, the emissions calculation is actually pretty straightforward. But estimating these factors are the most difficult part, and that's why the use of those defaults when project sponsors don't have specific information is really, really useful. So moving into the cost effectiveness, which again we did for the first time in 2016, this is a fairly, full disclosure, this is a fairly simplistic method of doing this. We spent some time doing a bit of research looking at how other MPOs were handling this. And this was the formula that we landed on. So essentially, the cost effectiveness is the funding request divided by the useful life of the project divided by the annual emissions reduction. And so the funding request, of course, that is what the sponsor is strategically submitting for. How much CMAQ dollars are they asking for? The useful life, we decided to use the information provided by both the Federal Highway and Federal Transit Administration on the varying useful lives of different assets. And then we use our project level emissions estimation tool to estimate the annual emissions reduction. The other thing I would note is we spent a lot of time with our committees as we prepped for this as to whether or not the data point should be CMAQ dollars requested or total project cost. There was a lot of debate back and forth, and this was ultimately what we landed on as the determination for, at least for now, using the CMAQ dollars requested as opposed to the total project cost. There's pros and cons of both, but this is what we used. So in terms of, this was a change in 2016. So in terms of how we launched this with our sponsors, we provided a lot of guidance information, and we showed them. We really went through an education process to show sponsors kind of, depending on your project, depending on the type of your project, depending on the scale of your project, also helping them strategically decide, should you be requesting CMAQ, should you be requesting a different funding source, just the general scale of emissions reduction potential. This is the old version where we based our air quality score on the magnitude of emissions benefit only, and it just gave folks a sense of, depending on what type of project you're submitting, where your emissions reduction potential might fall. And then in 2016, and again, these are illustrative. They were based on actual project submittals that we had. So this is in no way saying that all projects of these type are going to land in this way. But we wanted to go through an exercise to really allow for the strategic thinking on our sponsors' part, moving towards cost effectiveness. Where might your project land, and choose both? Does it make sense for you to request CMAQ, and maybe think about how much you're requesting? So this is just showing moving from looking at the magnitude of emission reductions to moving to the cost effectiveness, where different project types and different scales might land within that spectrum. And I will say that the 2016 process, while it was bumpy, you know, anytime we make a change, that's difficult. But it was successful in the end, and folks now kind of, I think they appreciated us really showing them, you know, under the hood, this is how things are done, this is how we use the data, these are the emission factors, these are the defaults, here's how the score is going. So they got a lot more education on how all of this plays out, and I think they're, we're going to continue using this in the future. So really that's the last slide that I have, and just noting that we are starting our competitions again right now. We have launched our project selection task force. We have about, I would say, 26 of our board members engaged in that conversation. They're going to adopt our policy framework in January. We'll conduct our competition in the spring, and then we'll move forward. I think that, you know, we worked quite closely with our, not just all of our staff committees around the region and our elected officials, but also our air quality consultation partners. We have a pretty close relationship with them, and so I think this was a very positive move forward with our CMAQ. We're proud of how we select our CMAQ dollars in the regional competition. There's quite a bit of regional TDM projects, regional transit projects on the, as well as diesel emission, diesel particulate emission reduction projects. So we get some diesel retrofit projects in the regional competition as well, which, as you know, is a focus of CMAQ. And then in the countywide side, it's a little bit more of the, as I mentioned earlier, the bicycle pedestrian investments, which are more local scale, some of the smaller scale transit, smaller scale ITS, those types of things. And with that, I will turn it back over to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kelly, and thank you, Jason, as well, for your presentations. They were great. Thank you very much. Just real quickly, want to let everyone know that we do have quite a few questions, so hang on the line here as we help have Kelly and Jason answer some of your questions from earlier in the presentation. Real quickly, before we ask the first question, I do have a couple or one or two polling questions to ask you. If you don't mind answering them real quickly, what best describes you? We're trying to get a better idea of who is on this call today for future planning purposes. So while I do that, Jason and Kelly, the first question is, can you please elaborate on the specific bike-related facilities that are eligible for CMAQ funding? For example, I heard that bike sharing systems were eligible for everything but the costs associated with purchasing bikes themselves. Is that still the case?
Kelly, do you have any experience in Puget Sound with bike share?
Yeah, so we've had a couple of bike share projects. I can't give you the definitive answer on all of the details. I can just share with you our experience. We did have a couple of bike share programs that were funded, and I think you're correct. We were not able, if memory serves, we were not able to purchase the bicycles or the helmets, I believe, with the CMAQ dollars, but the infrastructure components were certainly eligible. Unfortunately, in our instance, that project ended up being canceled, and we don't have a lot of other similar elements other than some other bike facilities at various transit stations. But yeah, I think that you're correct in that the bicycles themselves were not eligible.
Yeah, and the guidance itself, and I don't know, Casey, if you have the ability to turn back the power to me for the slide. I'm just pulling up the guidance.
Yep, I can. Give me 1 second here. I'll do it right now. Okay, you should be back.
Okay. Let's see, share screen. I don't know if you can see my show screen. I don't know if you can see my screen here, but I have the guidance for bicycle and pedestrian facilities. It really talks about the bike racks and support facilities. This is something that, quite frankly, we need to spend more time working with Federal Highways on. They give in their guidance very specifically bicycle and pedestrian programs website, and this is something that there we go, that I would suggest looking to. I will tell you, this is another one of those projects where, in some cases, CMAQ funds have been allowed, at least tentatively. I believe in Tennessee they were allowed at one point, and I believe there's another state. I guess California, but I'm not going to speak definitively about that. But again, I think one of the challenges with the bicycle is less the eligibility of the bicycle itself in terms of CMAQ dollars. I think the underlying problem has been the ability for a Buy America waiver. Most bicycles that are available on the market are made in many ways with Canadian steel, which would violate Buy America without a waiver. I've been in and out of that specific debate over the course of a few years, and I'm not sure if there's been definitive changes, but it is something that there is very little specific guidance for or against, and it's another one of those issues that it depends on what state you're in and who's making the decision as to whether or not it's specifically eligible. But it is clear that bike racks, support facilities, etc., are eligible. The other, I think, determination that a lot of organizations are making, or that the Federal Highways is making the basis as well, has been upon the determination that in many ways bike share they view as recreational, and that it does not take trips away. So I think if you are going to submit a grant for bike share to be funded under CMAQ, be prepared to have good and accurate modeling that'll show trips reduced rather than simply usage. I think the key thing is their trips reduced from all ulterior motives. And to be very blunt with you, I would strongly urge that in lieu of trying to go after CMAQ funds, you look at how TAP funds in your area are being spent, and sort of look to props funded under there.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jason, and thank you, Kelly, for that. And we just did ask another polling question, if you guys don't mind filling that out for us real quickly here. And while we do that, Jason, I think this is probably more for you, but Kelly, if you can give input after as well, that would be great. Under what category does rideshare matching software procurement fall? Is it limited to 5 years?
It is a technology, and no, it is not 5 years. It is in theory eligible, without doubt. And again, if I could share my screen again. What?
I'm sorry, you want me to share your screen?
If I could see my screen again, yeah, that'd be great. You can see here, carpool marketing, vanpool marketing covers existing, expanded new activities, then increased vanpools. Purchase includes purchase and use of computerized matching software and outreach to employers. So under the guidance here, it's very clear that you can utilize computerized matching software beyond the 5-year limit.
Okay, great. Thank you. I don't know, Kelly, do you have anything to add to that or no?
No, not at all.
Okay, the next question, your note, small scale ITS as cost effective. Can you give some examples of what ITS projects are considered small scale?
Sure. So we've seen the range of, the regional scale would be a county-wide signal coordination type of activity versus a smaller scale would be single intersection updates to, adding adaptive signals to a single intersection or a smaller area versus that. It's really kind of the geographic basis and the reach of the benefits and the investment.
Okay, great. Thank you. Jason, we've received mixed guidance on the procurement of leased vanpool vehicles. Can you provide insight as to whether vanpool contracts for service, example, leased vanpool vehicles, must still comply to Buy America provisions?
Yes, without any doubt, So one of the challenges has been how the grant is administered. The best recommendation I can make in terms of a vanpool program, if it is using CMAQ dollars, is to transfer administration over to the Federal Transit Administration. A lot of CMAQ grants that are transit-oriented can be transferred and administered by the FTA. But regardless, with Buy America, there are two separate sets of rules for FTA and FHWA. Regardless of that, you are subject to FTA Buy America requirements. And right now, if you are using CMAQ funds and you are using a small vehicle, not the 9 to 15 passenger vehicle, but a 7-passenger vehicle, you're required to submit a Buy America waiver. Federal Highways does these once a quarter. They're automatic, it's systematic, and if your vehicle does not meet the Buy America requirements for the smaller 7 to 15 passenger, and that's steel and final assembly, and none of the smaller vehicles meet the requirements, then you need to apply for a waiver. I would urge you to talk to your state Federal Highway Administration, contact, let them know the types of vehicle you're using, and let them know ask them what process you need to follow on in terms of getting that waiver submitted. But they are, Federal Highway goes through these quarterly, where FTA sort of does a first come, first serve. Now, FTA, they recently announced a blanket waiver for the smaller vehicles, and basically the vehicle just needs to be, final assembly needs to be in the U.S. And certainly there's information on the ACT website in terms of what vehicles qualify for that, and no additional action is needed in terms of waivers. But with CMAQ, with Federal Highway, you need a specific waiver.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jason. We'll probably have time here for one more question. If we did not get to your question today, please feel free, as I have on the screen here, Jason and Kelly's email, to ask any questions further that you might have for either one of them. But Kelly, this last question I believe is for you. Is the PSRC tool used for education and outreach programs too? Are there examples that you can point to of past projects?
Sure. I don't have the tool in front of me. I don't think that the tool itself can estimate outreach and education. What we would do is we do have a tab for TDM type projects, and we rely on the sponsor to describe a TDM project, what are the elements involved, and then describe what they expect the benefits would be in terms of, usually it's in terms of an increase in transit ridership. And if they don't have that information, as I mentioned, we have some default data that we can look at the type of project, the scale of the project, and make some assumptions on that. And the education and outreach would just be one element that leads into that final factor. And when we ask the sponsor to provide that information, we want to make sure that it's based on something. So often what we'll get is it's a continuation of an existing program or expansion of an existing program. So they have survey data. We have a trip reduction program in our state, and we've got many systems throughout our various jurisdictions, so they have a lot of data involved. And so when a project comes and they're talking about an expansion to a new area, to an existing system or something like that, it's usually a pretty good bet that they can draw on some of that existing data, regardless of the, considering the elements that they're going to include in their program, what is the expected ridership benefit, and it's really that data that goes into the tool so that we can estimate the emissions.
Okay, great. Well, I just want to take a moment and thank you both again. This is a great webinar. People had a ton of questions. And just for everyone, a reminder for everyone again, too, we did record this session. It will be up on the ACT website within about 24 hours, so check back then. Otherwise, again, thank you, Kelly and Jason, for the webinar today. And we truly do appreciate it. And thank you all for listening in. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.